morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's Farm Progress webinar, Maximizing Corn, Soybean, and Cotton Yields, the Economic Power of Mid-Season Foliar Applications, sponsored by ICL and broadcast by Informa. I'm Pam Caraway, and I'll be your moderator today. We have just a few announcements before we begin. This webinar is designed to be interactive. Our first poll question should be up on your screen now. Part of how you will experience this webinar is through these poll questions. And we would first like to hear from you about, ICL would like to know which of their products you've used previously. Please select all of the options that apply directly on the screen and then click Submit. As you do that, we'd like you to know the dock of widgets at the bottom of your screen will allow you to learn about today's speakers, download resources, interact with this webinar, and participate in the Q&A session that takes place at the end of our presentation. I'm sure you're all going to have plenty of good questions for us. The slides will advance automatically throughout the event. Toward the end of our webinar, we will ask you to complete our survey. Please take a minute to fill this out before leaving us today, as your feedback will provide us with valuable information and how we can improve future events. We are also excited to offer CEU credits for attending this webinar. At the end of the presentation, there will be a QR code you can scan to claim your credits, so keep an eye out for that. Also, please be aware that you're going to need to use the app the CCA app to go to that location and to get your CEU credits. Lastly, if you're experiencing any technical problems, please click the help widget found at the bottom of your screen, or type your issue into the Q&A area, and we will be glad to offer one-on-one assistance. I can tell you from personal experience, we have great IT folks on the other end of this. We want you to have an enjoyable experience today. So now on to the presentation. Maximizing corn, soybean, and cotton yields, the economic power of mid-season foliar applications. Discussing today's topic is Christi Falen, Western Agronomy Technical Services Manager at ICL, and Dr. Jason Haegele, Marketing and Innovation Manager at ICL Growing Solutions North America. To learn more about our speakers, please visit the speakers widget. Now, Dr. Jason Haegele, over to you.
Thank you, Pam, and good afternoon to everyone. On behalf of ICL, I welcome you to our webinar this afternoon, and we have some exciting data and perspectives on mid-season foliar applications for corn, soybeans, and cotton that we would like to share with you. But the principles we're discussing today ultimately extend to other crops as well. If you're not familiar with ICL, ICL is a global company, leader in specialty mineral applications in the food, industrial, and agricultural industries. Our growing solutions, or especially fertilizer business, has been around for many decades, focused on water-soluble fertilizers, but also liquid fertilizers, biostimulants, and a broad range of specialty nutrition products for all types of crops and cropping systems. At this point, I'd like to bring in my colleague, Christi, and we're going to be going back and forth in this webinar, talking about various aspects of foliar nutrition, especially applied to mid-season applications on row crops, corn, soybeans, and cotton being our primary examples. And the question that I would pose to you, Christi, are which specific nutrients are most essential during the reproductive stages of corn, soybeans, and cotton, and ultimately, how do they impact the yield and quality of those crops?
Hey, yeah, thanks, Jason. Well, let's talk about a few of them today. When we get started, we want to think about zinc, and we know how important it is for us. We know that we need the boron for being able to have our flowering and set that. We need our molybdenum and our cobalt for being able to do nitrogen use efficiency and definitely keep our flower set on there. So we need to make sure that we're doing everything possible to increase our nitrogen use efficiency and our nitrogen fixation so that we can have a better yield potential, keep our nutrients in balance so that we can have good photosynthesis, good nutrient use efficiency overall. But I think, some of the ones that we sometimes forget about is the potassium and how important it is. And, we set the groundwork for it, but we also don't want to forget that we can do some foliar applications of potassium. We'll use this example with corn as one of those where we look at the growth stage here on the diagram on the right of corn. And we see as we approach that grand growth phase and we're still vegetative, but we start to transition to tassel formation and R1, that we have a huge increase in the potassium uptake and the requirements of those corn plants. And so as we're trying to meet those demands, we've done everything to lay the groundwork initially with our fertilizer and our fertigation, if that's part of our system. But we can also think about doing timely foliar applications that can really help us with finishing that crop off and not having our yield be limited and helping our quality as well. Plus our stomatal functioning and the potassium helping us with the plant vigor, helping us to fight against diseases and injury. And so we know how critical that potassium is for being able to help us with transporting other nutrients as well. So let's make sure that we don't limit it at all. We definitely set the potential early on, and then we finish it off with our foliar applications of potassium. There's a lot of different choices that we can do for fertigation that we may be putting on, and starter fertilizers that we may be doing. But in addition to that, there's some of those that we could pick and we would have the versatility to use as a foliar application as well. So Nova Peak, for example, a 05234, we could use it early on for our starters and our fertigation, but we could also utilize it as a foliar application. And it has actually a little bit of an acidic component to it when you have a 1% of the solution. So that actually could help us with, if we're putting it on with some of our fungicides or insecticides, we could be able to lower that pH of that spray solution a little bit and be able to get even better uptake. So thinking about things on the context of, products that we can use in multiple different avenues, it's nice to have that flexibility. So in addition to that, we think about some of our micronutrients that are really important, and we don't usually, we don't always think about them. So the little bits of moly, a little bit is necessary, is critical. We can overdo as well. But if we do the correct amounts of the molybdenum and the nickel, then we can actually increase our nitrogen use efficiency, because the molybdenum is actually a key component of the nitrate reductase and the nitrogenase when we're looking at nitrogen cycling. And nickel is part of the hydrogenase and urease enzymes for nutrient cycling as well. So those two little ones in small quantities can really help us with the nitrogen use efficiency and maximizing the nitrogen that we put on for our crops. We think about the cobalt as another option if we're trying to retain our flowers, whether we're talking for grain or for cotton, either way, we want to make sure that we're retaining our flowers and we're keeping them on for a longer period of time, because that means that we have more yield potential that's there. So the cobalt is a natural way to make sure that the ethylene production is kept in check and we're not losing our flowers. In addition to that, if we have a chlorophyll production and photosynthesis that's going on at a higher rate with our nickel and our moly, then we have a higher yield potential that comes into play. So again, these little ones that can really help us go to the next level as far as the micronutrients. Zinc, we know we've got to put that on early on with our, normally we do a lot of them when we do the starters, but we can also put some on as a foliar We have to make sure that it's there so that we can have good shoot elongation, good root growth, so that we can have better nutrient and water uptake, as well as the auxin and chlorophyll synthesis. And then the boron, kind of mentioned some of that before, how critical it is for flowering and pollination, and that it helps with the differentiation of the meristematic cells. So that's important to make sure that we're getting it there into the crops. And then we can have the boron be transported and utilized throughout the plant. So that's a good thing as well. So we really want to set the stage with making sure that those are in play. So here's a poll question for you. Do you use foliar nutrients mid-season? You can go ahead and answer those questions. So as we start looking at foliar applications and some flexibility and what we can do, Jason, can you help us with some of the ideas of how you could see the flexibility and the foliar applications coming into play?
Yeah, certainly, Christi. So one of the main things that I often think about, especially as it relates to micronutrients, is the soil constraints that exist for optimal plant uptake of those nutrients. Know that soil or many soils contain a vast amount of untapped nutrition. There are factors like soil pH that limit the uptake of those nutrients or limit the availability of those nutrients for uptake. So when we have situations, for example, a high pH soil that may limit the uptake of micronutrients, foliar application may be a more efficient or optimal way to get those essential nutrients into the plant, thereby bypassing some of the constraints that do exist in the soil, whether that be related to pH or simply due to the fact that specific nutrient isn't present in the soil at a high enough concentration for crop development and growth. Also, I think about the rapid explosion of what I'll call analytics in crop production and agronomy. So things like tissue testing, sap testing, and other approaches. Remote sensing is an example that over time are giving us a more precise picture for what's actually going on in those plants in almost real time, to be able to make in-season decisions about whether a particular nutrient is needed for the environmental conditions present at that time, the yield potential of the crop, as well as the ever-changing economic constraints for growing crops. And then the last thing I'll mention is that the optimal timing for delivering a nutrient may be different based on the nutrient, as well as the crop and what's going on in that crop at a specific time during the growing season. So here we have an example for a soybean nutrition plant, nutrition plan rather, highlighting ICL products. But what I'd like to focus in on here are these three buckets: vegetative or early vegetative, that flowering stage in soybeans, as well as the later season stages of pod formation and grain filling. And so let's just take a minute to think about what's going on in the soybean crop at these three different times during the growing season. Early in the season, as that crop has emerged, V3, V4, it's getting established, growing a root system, developing the architecture and framework for subsequent growth and yield. But at the same time, we know that soybeans are establishing nodules early in the growing season, setting up that potential for season-long nitrogen fixation. So at that point, some of the nutrients that Christi highlighted, like cobalt and molybdenum and nickel and others, may be critical for ensuring that those nodules form and are very efficient to fix nitrogen throughout the growing season. As we move to flowering, we know that at times there's considerable stress on the soybean crop, whether that be drought, high temperature, but also nutritional stresses. And anything that we can do to alleviate stresses, including nutritional stresses, helps to retain flowers, pods, and ultimately the yield potential of the soybean crop. And then finally, as we get later into the season during pod formation and then transitioning into grain filling, there's an intense demand on the soybean crop for nutrient uptake, as well as nutrient remobilization to fill those developing pods. And potassium is a key one that Christi's already highlighted that is required in significant amounts throughout the entire season for a soybean crop that becomes particularly important late in the season as those pods are filling. All right. So here we have the results of that poll question. Do you use foliar nutrients mid-season? And it seems pretty split, where we have about half of the participants saying yes and about half the participants saying no. So we're going to continue on our presentation, but I would ask or encourage those that did say no. If you wouldn't mind, provide some feedback in the Q&A section about why you don't currently use nutrients foliar applied during the season. Is it related to operational constraints? You simply haven't seen the benefit of foliar applications, or other factors that I haven't highlighted or mentioned. So, Christi, you started to talk about products at the beginning of this presentation, and highlighted some of the options we might use for applying potassium as an example during the season. But to further build on that, what are some of the research-backed foliar products or solutions that ICL offers that you're most excited about in terms of yield and profitability, either on the row crops that we're talking about here, or some of the specialty crops that you also have experience with?
Yeah, so I think highlighted here 4 of our key products that we'd be looking at: the Nova Pulse, Nova Elevate, Nova Finish, and Nova Flow. Those are some ones that I would kind of like to highlight for you to think about how we could utilize them, and those micronutrients and the foliar potassium, how it can really help you with that, and the zinc. So when you look at options of what we could do, the Nova Elevate has the moly and the cobalt in it in a high concentration. So that's what we would do earlier on, set the stage for nitrogen use, efficiency, and yield. Then the Nova Pulse, it also has the moly and cobalt in it, as well as zinc, and it's a 064, plus it has magnesium and sulfur. So a good overall combination that can help you. And then especially when we've combined it with the Nova Flow, then we see some even bigger benefits from that standpoint. As far as the overall, I'll show you some highlights of them as we go through, and you'll see them where we can have the grain or the grape yield in particular that I'll showcase for you. And then Nova Flow and Nova Finish, as we finish off that season, you've got the high potassium that you would need, where you could be able to fertigate it or do foliar applications. Nova Finish with its 40% potassium can really help you with finishing that yield off strong and keeping the quality component up and the stomata open. So here you can see a cross section of the 4 of the different products. For your soybean crops, the Nova Pulse or Nova Elevate. The Pulse was designed for that nitrogen fixation and really boosting that. And then you have the Elevate, same thing. And then the Finish with its 40% potassium, but also the 8 nitrogen and the 12 on the phosphorus, as well as a full chelated micro package, is great to finish off the season and do your foliar applications. And then the Flow with its 5-10-20 plus the 9% magnesium and the sulfur and a little bit of boron that we talked about is a great combo. So then if you think about the combination of them together, the reason that I would suggest the Nova Flow and the Nova Pulse, you can see those if you match up the nutrients as you go down, then you see you've got good NPKs, magnesium, boron, copper, moly, and zinc. So a really good combination as far as the highlighted of the foliar options that we highlighted could really enhance your yield potential. So putting those 2 together would be a good option. Earlier on, you could have done in a high concentration, you could do your Nova Elevate, you can see that there. And then again, finishing off strong with that 40% potassium, as well as the micro mix on the finish, would be some good options to consider. So here's another question for you. What nutrient are you most concerned with for mid-season applications? If you would, to pick those. And as you're answering them, then we'll move on to the next, we'll move on to the next piece to the puzzle. So Jason, what early to mid-season foliar applications are you particularly interested in for optimizing the yield and quality?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Christy. So as I started to describe earlier, I think some of the reasons for considering a foliar application are around precision and applying nutrients when they're most impactful for the crop, and then also thinking about ever increasing crop yields for corn, soybeans, cotton, and many common crops across the U.S. This increase in yield and the genetic potential that is brought about this increase in yield is often associated with very rapid periods of nutrient uptake or sustained periods of nutrient uptake across many weeks during the growing season. And foliar applications help to complement our soil applied nutrient application approaches. So here's one example that I'm going to provide as a to bring home the point, and this is again for soybeans, looking at uptake and partitioning curves for two nutrients, potassium on the left and manganese on the right. So let's first focus on potassium on the left, and what you'll see here is that again, as we get into the grand growth period of this particular crop, soybean, we have a very rapid uptake rate for potassium if we were to calculate this in pounds of K2O per acre per day. But more importantly, look at the length of time over which this rapid linear, looking at the same type of rate from right around R1 in between R or V7 and R2 all the way up through the mid R stages. And so we're hopeful that based on our soil applied potassium application, at some point before the growing season, whether it's a spring broadcast or a fall broadcast, we have adequate potassium available in the soil between fertilizer applied as well as native nutrition in the soil. But we also know that potassium availability and uptake from the soil is influenced by soil characteristics like clay mineralogy as well as soil moisture. And so well-timed potassium applications made to the foliage during the growing season can help to address potential shortcomings in potassium uptake from the soil. If we consider manganese on the right, you'll notice that again, manganese uptake, although smaller, is significant throughout the entire growing season or much of the growing season for soybeans. But if you focus on the part of the partitioning pattern that is the dark green, we find that most of the manganese taken up by the soybean crop, are about 50% of the total manganese is found in the leaves. This makes sense because manganese is heavily involved in the photosynthetic process, and by applying manganese directly to the foliage with a well-timed foliar application, we can help to maintain and improve that photosynthetic capacity during the growing season to help achieve a high yield in a soybean crop. All right, here are the results of the last poll question, and it seems like the two nutrients that really stand out here are potassium being the number one nutrient of greatest concern, sulfur number two, and then some of the micronutrients, particularly boron, being the third nutrient of greatest concern. With that, we're going to transition into some trial results. So Christy did a good job of outlining some of our main products that we're excited about, like Nova Pulse, Nova Finish, and Nova Flow. We're going to highlight trial results from these particular products, including Nova Flow on corn, soybeans, and cotton as well. So with that, Christy, would you introduce us to some of the corn trials that we've done over the last couple of years, particularly focused on Nova Pulse, but also Nova Flow as well?
Sure. So this one is looking at Nova Pulse across in 3 different locations. You can see them down on the bottom: Kentucky, Nebraska, and Wisconsin, and then the average on the right. The dark blue is the control, and then the lighter blue bar is Nova Pulse foliar application at 6 ounces per acre, put on at V4 on corn, as far as a critical growth stage and, you know, setting the yield potential for that corn at that point in time. So we see in Kentucky that we had a 12 bushel increase, Nebraska 7 bushel, 8 bushel in Wisconsin, so an average of a 9 bushel increase with the one application of the Nova Pulse. Again, the Nova Pulse has the cobalt and moly in it, as well as it's a 064 and has the zinc and manganese and some sulfur. So that properly timed application is really helping as far as the yield potential that came about on corn. So another one would be looking at, this one is in particular in Wisconsin, but looking at trying to apply both the Nova Elevate at an earlier time period. Again, this is the high moly and cobalt amounts in it. So we do have a low use rate. It is only 2 ounces per acre as far as a foliar application. But you can see here the significant yield response that was achieved with 5.2 bushels for putting on the Elevate by itself. And then when we put it on with an experimental additive to enhance the nutrient uptake, then we saw an 11.6 bushel increase. And then on the right-hand side, you look at the Nova Flow, you see the same pattern that was coming up where we're putting it on. The Nova Flow was put on at VTR1 with the fungicide, the Trivapro, and it was only 2 pounds to the acre that was put on. And we see that yield response that comes into play there. We see a 14 bushel increase over the control that we were able to get when we did the Nova Flow along with the experimental additive. So positive results that you can see that would definitely impact the economics, you know, the ROI as far as on the farm for, again, not a large amount of nutrient. It's just the precision and the timing that really helped. This was a farm trial that was done on corn, and it was in Nebraska with the Nova Pulse. And you can see here we had a 9 bushel increase, and this was pulse at 8 ounces per acre foliar application compared to the grower standard. Jason?
Yeah, so very similar to the trial results that Christi presented for corn. You know, Pulse is a nutrient product that we have demonstrated success and efficacy with on a broad range of crops, you know, corn and soybeans, but also a variety of specialty crops, including cherries, apples, and others. This is an example of 2024 soybean, you know, foliar trial, again, applying 6 ounces per acre of Nova Pulse, 6 dry ounces per acre at that V4 timing. Locations in Kentucky, Minnesota, Ohio, Iowa, and Wisconsin. You'll note that, you know, across these 5 locations, you know, all of the numerical increases in yield were positive, although there were a couple that were, you know, relatively small and likely not significant, like the one in Minnesota, potentially the location in Iowa as well. But averaged across these, you know, 5 locations, the average increase in yield for a one-time application of Nova Pulse at V4 is 3.8 bushels per acre, which is in line with some other, you know, trial results that we've seen from this particular product on soybeans. So as one example, this is a 2023 trial from Wisconsin where we again had Nova Pulse applied at 6 ounces per acre, but we did it at a couple of different application timings, so V4, V6, as well as an application R1, R2. And then also in this trial, we had Nova Finish applied at R1, R2. So what we saw in this 2023 trial was that actually the R1, R2 application was you know, significantly, you know, greater than the control. You know, numerical increase in yield for the V4, V6 application, but based on these trial results, the R1, R2 single application would be the, you know, the more optimal timing. If you focus on the 4th bar from the left, the blue bar, 79.5 bushels versus the control yield of 72.4 bushels per acre. We actually had a bigger response from a sequential 2-pass application of NovaPulse. The first at V4 V6, again 6 ounces per acre, then followed by another 6 ounces per acre at R1, R2, leading to that 7.1 bushel per acre increase for the sequential application of NovaPulse versus the control. Switching gears into cotton, our focus for our cotton trials has really been around how we can get more potassium into the plant, whether that be through a soil application focused on potash as a control, but also considering ICL's polysulfate product, as well as competitive products like potassium sulfate, magnesium, or K-Mag, as is commonly known as a brand name in the marketplace. So in this example, we had, for this trial, we had three treatments. We had a control of potash, 0060 at 200 pounds per acre. And then compared to that, we had, two programs. One would be a combination of K-Mag along with potassium nitrate as the foliar option. The potassium nitrate applied at 5 pounds of product per acre. And then the ICL program would be polysulfate as the soil applied nutrition containing calcium, sulfur, magnesium, and potassium, along with our NovaFlow product applied at 3 pounds of product per acre. Both of these foliar applications were applied at early bloom in cotton. This trial was conducted at University of Georgia at Tifton. And what we see in this is that both of the the programs, whether it's the K-Mag plus potassium nitrate or the polysulfate plus NovaFlow, significantly increased lint yield over the control, suggesting that there's better ways to apply potassium and a variety of nutrients through a combined approach of soil nutrition as well as the foliar nutrition. This is an example from Texas A&M at Lubbock. Again, you'll notice the soil applied component with polysulfate in the second treatment from the left. And then the third and fourth bars from the left would be the combination of polysulfate as the base soil applied nutrition, along with 2 ICL options for applying foliar potassium. NovaFlow is the 5, 10, 20 product that also includes some boron and magnesium as well. And then Nova High Peak is a 0, 44, 44 analysis, just containing only phosphorus and potassium. Both NovaFlow and Nova High Peak were applied at 10 pounds of product per acre. So there are some differences in the amount of potassium that each of these products are contributing. But we see an increase in lint yield for these foliar applications over the base treatment of polysulfate by itself as the soil applied nutrition. And then the last example for cotton is from a 2022 North Carolina trial in eastern North Carolina. The 3 bars on the left in the dark blue are soil applied approaches. We have grower standard of potash, or rather the grower standard plus a biostimulant, and then a biostimulant plus polysulfate. Really no difference in lint yield for those 3 treatments. But if we pan over to the right side of this graph, where we have a combined or systems approach of a biostimulant along with polysulfate as the soil applied nutrition or treatment, along with 3 approaches to foliar applied potassium, Nova Peak, which is monopotassium phosphate, 05234, High Peak, the 04444 analysis, or Finish, the 81240 analysis with some micronutrients. We see a trend for increased lint yields from these foliar applied nutrition approaches that primarily focus on potassium, but in some cases contribute some other nutrition as well. So to round out my part and talking about the data, I also want to circle back and talk a little bit more about the importance of timing. We've already introduced 2 of these examples already, but I want to dive into the corn example from Wisconsin in a little more detail, as well as a soybean trial example from Wisconsin as well. So if we look at this example from this past year in Wisconsin, focused on Nova Elevate at an early stage application at V4, as well as the Nova Flow application at VT R1. Really the purpose for choosing these timings and these particular products is to accomplish two things. One is to coincide with crop protection applications that are likely occurring at these growth stages. So, for example, at V4, V6, this could potentially be a herbicide application timing, or for those who are doing an early season fungicide or plant health application, it could coincide with that as well. And then certainly at VTR1, that's a great time to apply a foliar fungicide if you choose to do that, as well as to focus on other nutrients that are really important at that time, like boron. So if we consider what's going on in the corn crop at V4, V6, again, the crop is establishing itself. It's setting up a root system. V5 is determining the number of kernel rows around the ear, and also establishing the metabolic machinery and the photosynthetic machinery for continued vegetative growth and developing the yield potential of that crop. And so by applying Nova Elevate, which is high in molybdenum at that time, we're supporting some of those fundamental physiological and growth processes that are occurring at that time. Similarly at the fungicide timing, we understand that the crop is pollinating. Those kernels are making the decision about whether to continue developing or not. Nutrition being a key component of that, and with Nova Flow containing not only potassium but magnesium and boron as well, we're providing the nutrients that are needed most at that particular time during the season to help with adequate grain fill during the year. And then lastly, from a timing perspective, we again have this example from soybeans in Wisconsin in 2023, where we had Nova Pulse applied at 2 times during the season, V4, V6, as well as R1, R2. And those timings were again chosen to coincide with common crop protection timings in soybeans, V4, V6 being post-emergence herbicide timing. And then at R1, R2, being the beginning of the fungicide application season, insecticides if needed, but also a great time to apply needed nutrients to help support those flowering and pod development processes that are starting to kick off at that particular time. Christi, if you would you talk a little bit more about this grower soybean trial in Iowa this past year, and then maybe also relate this to some of your similar experiences in grapes and specialty crops that you've had along the way?
Yeah, having some lighting issues here. Let me try and see if I can get, okay. So there we go. So these were put on as far as insecticides, fungicide, that's an option of what we can do with the soybeans. And so here we had both that were being put on, and then we have Nova Pulse and Nova Flow that were put in along with those at that time period. So logistically, a really good option. And then when we did that, and you look at it from the standpoint of what's going on, then you can see that the left half with the grower standard practice was not doing near as good as the right half, where there was a foliar application that was put on, much greener option as we see the days after planting, and it goes through. And then as we follow it, you look at the left side was where we were putting on the Nova Pulse and the Nova Flow with the fungicide and insecticide, compared to doing it on the right-hand side was looking at the grower standard only. The fungicide and insecticide was the only piece to the puzzle. So then does it make a difference economically? Is it a good option as far as that goes? You have your Nova Pulse and your Nova Flow on the left, more pods per plant, definitely in comparison to the ones on the right. So then the additional piece of the puzzle would be, what about yield? Here's another example with the insecticide, the Demelin. And so we see a response here of 36 bushels up to 41 and a half from the standpoint of that. And as we do that, silly cat, we definitely see a yield response there with that boron. So boron is an important piece of the puzzle that we talked about earlier. And then if we look at cotton, as far as the control here, at Arkansas was 914 pounds on cotton compared to 1,011 and 1,061 with putting on 4 to 8 ounces of the boron extra. So definitely saw a yield response there, 11 to 16% yield response that you can get from a small application of boron at the right timing. Jason?
Thank you, Christi. So to wrap up here this afternoon, we've talked about examples of mid-season foliar applications for corn, soybean, and cotton, and the potential impact that that can have on crop yield, and then ultimately the the ROI for the retailer and the grower. Foliar potassium is, in our opinion, a really key tool to enhance yield across a broad range of crops, as well as increasing quality in many of the specialty crops, the fruits and vegetables that we deal with across our market areas. Often micronutrients are maybe considered to be the main approach for foliar applications during the growing season, but we would argue that a balanced approach focused on N, P, and K, as well as key micronutrients helps to overall improve overall nutrient use efficiency, as well as the yield of the specific crop that you're focused on. And then finally, the main point is really that foliar nutrition is precise and appropriately timed and appropriately chosen products, whether it's an ICL product or product from other manufacturers, to increase yield for our crops this growing season. If you have further questions after this webinar, you can reach out to Christi and I directly at the email addresses shown here on the screen. But also I would encourage you to visit us at icl-growingsolutions.us to learn more about ICL as a company and all the great agronomic and educational resources that we have available at our website. But also follow us on Facebook, as well as LinkedIn, and our Growing Solutions America's YouTube page, where we have video recordings of mini webinars like this, focused on different products and different crops across the U.S. and Canada as well. With that, I'll push it back to Pam to provide any final comments and directions to the participants. And also, I believe we have some time to answer any questions that may have come in from the audience during our presentation.
Also, you should be seeing the QR code we mentioned earlier, and I can see it's on your screen. Please scan this using your CCA app if you would like to claim CEU credit for today's presentation. And now on to the question and answer portion of our event. As a reminder, to participate in Q&A, just type your question into the text box located next to presentation window, or click the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. If we are not able to answer all submitted questions during today's webinar, we'll be sure to share them with our speaker, who can reply to you offline. We've had questions just rolling in. Here's a fun one. What's your cat's name? Christi?
Sorry, what was that?
What's your cat's name?
Oh, that's Whiskers, crazy cat. I was trying to get her out and she is not cooperating. So sorry about that, guys.
Oh, good. I think it was a delightful interlude there. We like to see children and pets. Another question we have is, what is the cost per acre for the recommended foliar nutrients? Jason or Christi?
Sure, that's a great question. I think for row crops like corn and soybeans as one example, we all realize that commodity markets are challenging. Frequently, corn and soybean prices aren't necessarily great right now, and input prices are high as well. But generally, my rule of thumb is cost per acre to the grower for quality foliar program should be somewhere between $5 and $10 per acre. And just as a point of reference for Nova Pulse, product we talked about a lot in this webinar, based on pricing to distribution, as well as assumptions about retail margin, the break even yield for farmer for for corn, based on current corn prices of about 450 per bushel would be 1.7 bushels per acre, and then for soybeans, based on $10.25 per bushel, soybeans, break even would be about 0.8 of a bushel. So, main point is that these are not intended to be costly foliar programs, but we try to back it up with trial data like what we've provided here today as an example.
Great, thank you so much. And now we have a participant asking for suggestions on spraying time, dilution, etc.
Spraying time and dilution. So in general for these these trials, and just as a general best practice statement, we would recommend at least 10 gallons per acre of carrier volume for ground applications. Obviously, to ensure good coverage, particularly for some of these nutrients that are present in small amounts, like the micronutrients, molybdenum, cobalt, and others. But fully realizing that product like NovaFlow at a fungicide application is likely going to go out with an airplane or a helicopter. There's going to be volume limitations there, and then with the growing drone application market, that provides an even greater challenge or difference to carrier volume. So although we don't have significant experience with products like NovaPulse and Nova Elevate through drones, just based on the relatively low application rates of these products, 2 to 6 dry ounces per acre, they should be well suited for drone-based applications as well.
Great. And now we have a compliment and a question. Our participant says this is a great presentation. Can you comment on the relationship and compatibility between Nova Pulse and biostimulants microorganisms in soybean yields?
Yes, that's also a good question. So you provide a little greater context. Nova Pulse is a product that originated in Brazil, where it's been a very successful commercial product in the Brazilian market, specifically for soybeans. But also, realizing that in Brazil there's a much greater focus on nutrients like molybdenum, cobalt, and nickel to help support nitrogen fixation in soybeans. Compared to the U.S. market, in Brazil, there's a much greater reliance on inoculating soybeans with rhizobia, and these combinations of microelements like cobalt, nickel, and molybdenum are used in combination to help support that nodulation and fixation process, either applied as a seed treatment to the seed in some products, but then in the case of Nova Pulse as a foliar application to help continue the development and fixation of those nodules over time. And just to kind of wrap up that question, in general, I think as biologicals become more well established in agriculture, particularly in row crop agriculture, we have a lot to learn about how to make those microorganisms or biologicals as effective as possible. But I believe that providing the right nutrition, particularly many of these micronutrients, ultimately helps the microorganisms and the enzymatic processes that they are using to provide nutrition to the crop.
You touched on it a little bit, but we have a fellow who would like to know, how do you see benefits to applying manganese as part of a starter fertility package in corn?
It's an interesting idea or concept. I don't have a lot of personal experience in this, but I think in certain areas, particularly in the Eastern Corn Belt, where manganese is more of a limiting factor, it could be an effective approach to experiment with. In general, I think zinc is well established as maybe the primary micronutrient that is included in starter and furrow applications, but there are others like manganese that might be impactful. And we also had kind of elaborate on that further. We had some customer experience this past year of using Nova Elevate, although we position it as a foliar product, but using that as a in furrow application to help focus on the molybdenum that the Elevate product brings.
Excellent. So when fertigating, should the center pivot be running at a fast pace to limit the amount of water being applied? And is Nova Finish the only product to be used in fertigation?
Christi, I've been talking a lot. Do you want to take this one since you're more of an expert on fertigation?
So whenever we fertigate, we're going to be doing it at more towards the end of the set, like we would do a chemigation, our normal fertigation practice. So yeah, it's normally going on faster and towards the end of the set when we're putting it on from a fertigation standpoint. If you look at the products like a Nova Peak, Nova High Peak, Nova Finish, all of those could certainly be put on from a fertigation standpoint. We do have, on the potato side for us, we have some that are not wanting to put it on, as far as a foliar application. And so they're actually doing Nova Pulse and Nova Flow together and starting to look at that as a fertigation option as well. When we do that, then we usually have to increase the rate a little bit because we're not going to have the efficiency like we would from a foliar application. But it depends on the logistics. The other one from a logistics standpoint and kind of practical application from some of the earlier questions is when we've put on chickpeas or garbanzo beans, when we've put on the Nova Pulse, ideally, you see some of the responses like Jason had, we'd want to put it on with a fungicide or insecticide. But if that's not going to be done, then we put it on at herbicide timing because that was the only time logistically that we were sure it was going to go on. And we still saw a yield response from that one application at that point in time. So we can have the ideal timing, but then we have the practical put it on when it makes sense from a logistical standpoint.
Sometimes it's not up to the farmer, it's up to the weather, isn't it? If I want to do a test on soybeans, what would you recommend and what's the smallest amount of product I need to order to do a test?
Okay. So with Nova Pulse, that product is packaged, currently in a 44 pound bag, and you're gonna, scratch your head and say, why a 44 pound bag? 44 pounds, correlates to 20 kilograms. So with global manufacturing of products, sometimes there's some different package sizes. But we are also soon going to offer Nova Pulse in a different package size of a 10 pound bag, 4 to a case. So it'd be 40 pounds total, but in 10 pound increments. So if you think about 40 pounds or 44 pounds as kind of the smallest amount that can be ordered, that would be adequate to treat between 80 to 100 acres of soybeans, depending on the exact application rate that you decide to use in your evaluation or trial.
Sounds great. So Christina would like to know your thoughts on the use of humic and fulvic acids.
So I think that that's a great option. I mentioned earlier, and I forget that I'm not going to show you all the great stuff. I love all the specialty piece, but we definitely put on the Nova Elevate, Nova Pulse, Finish, and Flow, and saw very positive response on the grapes. But we also put on fulvic acid that we did as far as that piece to the puzzle to increase the nutrient uptake into the plants. And so typically we would utilize the fulvic acids from a foliar standpoint and more of the humic acids on a soil application basis as far as in general from that standpoint.
Remembering that farmers are business leaders, we have a question that goes to the economic side of this. How can growers maximize the return on investment when integrating foliar applications in their nutrient management plans?
It's a great question. I think we could approach this from different angles, but the first thing that comes to mind for me is that there are many products on the marketplace, and even more every day, that potentially have very specific application timings that are needed to make those products effective. Whether that be nutrients or biologicals or biostimulants, there may be an optimum time for applying that product, but it may not coincide with a pass or a trip that a farmer is already making across the field. So I think the main one of the main things is to choose products that are demonstrated to be effective at timings that would coincide with a pre-planned application of herbicide or insecticide, fungicide, plant growth regulator in the case of cotton or other crops. And I think some of the other factors that come to mind for me are choosing the right rate. That's an obvious one. But also ensuring that we have adequate carrier volume. Maybe in some cases using surfactant to help with coverage. Those are all factors that can help improve the distribution of nutrients on the plant, the uptake into the plant, and then ultimately the yield response that the farmer experiences.
So we mentioned a little earlier that sometimes the ideal time isn't always the right time or isn't always available. So what challenges do growers face with mid-season nutrient delivery, and how do ICL's foliar products address these challenges?
I think one of the challenges. Yeah, I'll answer, and then Christi, feel free to chime in as well. I think one of the challenges that I've observed, my time as an agronomist, is that the time comes to make an application, and then ultimately the grower doesn't know what's needed by that crop. And some approaches are based on tissue testing, but ultimately that answer maybe comes a little bit late and is looking in the rearview mirror as opposed to looking forward. I think at this point there's enough known about which nutrients are most likely to be deficient in a crop, and also which nutrients are most needed by particular crop at a particular time to support some growth process, whether that's nitrogen fixation and nodulation, or ear set in corn, whatever it might be. And so with the products that we've outlined today, NovaPulse, NovaFlow, NovaFinish in particular, we've got nutrient packages that are designed in different ways to really hone in on the nutrients that we would expect to be needed by a crop at a particular time. To help remove some of that ambiguity or indecision that a farmer might experience.
Christi, did you have anything to add?
I think you did a good job.
There you go. I think you both did a great job. That's all the time we have for questions today. We'll do one more reminder to scan the QR code on the screen with your CCA app if you would like to claim CEU credit for today's presentation. We all like to get credit every chance we can get, right? Thank you. We appreciate your time and expertise on today's topic. Thank you to our sponsor, ICL, as well as to everyone in the audience. We appreciate your attention and participation. We had great questions. Within the next 24 hours, you'll receive a personalized follow-up email with details and a link to today's presentation on demand. Please feel free to invite your colleagues and peers who may not have been able to listen to the event. On behalf of our guests, Christi Falen and Jason Haegele, I am Pam Caraway. Thanks for your time and have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.